We're delighted to have you all with us for this really lovely occasion. We've had some wonderful discussions so far on the nature of Jewish education and pushing the agenda and the envelope forward for all of us. I'm going to start panel 3 now, and I'm going to invite our 3 students to get ready. This panel revolves around the theme of creativity, engagement through expressions of creativity. 3 fantastic new pedagogies, new thoughts about pedagogies for our work. I'm really excited to share this work. I was privileged to work with 2 of our students, with Becca and Noam, and Cantor Louise Brightman working with Rachel. It's just been a privilege to see this work unfold and to witness the creativity that's come from the very nature of the questions that our students have. Rachel's going to begin as usual. There will be a Google Doc in the chat for some comments that you might want to make to help our students with taking their thinking forward, as well as the opportunity afterwards for some question and answer that we'll have together. So Rachel's title is Jewish Music and Memory, Ways Personalized Jewish Music Affects Elders Experiencing Losses. So Rachel, over to you.
Thank you. All right, let's flip over to the presentation slides here. Nope. Hi from Houston. It's great to be together. As Michael shared, the topic that I studied over the last year has been the ways in which familiar Jewish music affects elders with physical and neurological ailments, such as dementia or Alzheimer's disease. Is that loud enough, you think? Can I speak louder?
A bit louder, yes, please, Rachel.
Okay, great. Through a dozen or so interviews with music therapists, cantors, chaplains, and rabbis, it became very clear that sharing familiar music may cause one to be enlivened, transported, consoled, comforted, and many more physical and emotional responses, which we will get to. First, I would really like to have you all join me in listening or singing a song that across the board was mentioned as a powerful elicitor of memories, Oseh Shalom, by Nurit Hirsch. Oseh Shalom bimromav, uyaseh Shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'imru, imru, amen. Yaseh Shalom, Yaseh Shalom, Shalom Aleinu, V'al Kol Yisrael. Yaseh Shalom, Yaseh Shalom, Shalom Aleinu, V'al Kol Yisrael. Yaseh Shalom, Yaseh Shalom, Shalom Aleinu, V'al Kol Yisrael. Yaseh Shalom, Yaseh Shalom, Shalom Aleinu, V'al Kol Yisrael. Thank you. My mom calls these songs comfort food. Most of us can agree that there are songs out there that reach most people. With a Jewish lens, I ask the question, what categories can we actually pull from? We can pull from religious music with religious texts, such as Kol Nidre in the high holidays, Shalom Aleichem, the sounds of the shofar in Misha Berach. We can pull from the cultural category, which is a large category containing popular music heard on the radio, musical theater, holiday music sung around the table, Seder table, or during Hanukkah, and folk music. So some examples of those would be the Yiddish song by Mir Bist Shein, Hanukkah song Manishtana, or for Passover, Dayenu or Chad Gadya. And we can also pull from national music, melodies of the Jewish people, including Israeli folk songs such as Hatikva, Hava Nagila. So why familiar music? I take us to a YouTube video, short clip from Alive Inside.
First see Henry inert, maybe depressed, unresponsive, and almost unalive.
Henry.
Yeah?
Henry.
Yes, Joe.
I found your music. You want your music now? Okay. Let's try your music, okay? And then you tell me if it's too loud or not.
Then he is given an iPod containing, we know, his favorite music. And immediately he lights up. His face assumes expression. His eyes open wide. He starts to sing, to rock, and to move his arms, and he's being animated by the music.
And he used to always sit on the unit with his head like this. He didn't really talk to much people. And then when I introduced the music to him, this is his reaction ever since.
Great. That was from the documentary film Alive Inside, A Story of Music and Memory, and that's the story of Henry.
First see Henry inert.
Next, we have most of what I hear about the brains of people living with dementia is that the hippocampus, which I'll show you. I didn't see that. How much time is left? Thanks. Okay. I'll draw. The hippocampus, which is over here, in a brain not affected by dementia or other neurological ailments of memory loss, is about this size, let's say. But once you're in the later stages of Alzheimer's disease, it shrinks. And that's the place of the brain where long-term memories are stored. And another reduction you see is in white matter. Another shrinking that you see is in executive processing, which takes away basically your thinking and your memories. So all of these things lead to the difficulty of thinking and remembering. And that is responsible for the various behaviors that we see in people who are living with dementia. We think that, wow, this person is not quite the person I remember. This isn't the person that I know. However, the identity of that person is still there if we look beyond the changes to see what areas of the brain remain intact throughout the process of losing our memories. So what strengths remain? Let's clear these blues away. Okay. These are some parts that remain in our brains, even with memory loss. First, the auditory cortex, the ability to hear, the auditory cortex, and the limbic system, which is the brain's pathways for emotional memories, which are related to music. These remain prominent even after memory loss. Research shows that memories that were made during intense or emotionally charged periods of our lives are amongst the most vivid and recountable memories. Why is this important? Alzheimer's disease and other types of dementia and cognitive ailments affect millions of people in America today. 60% of nursing home residents have some sort of dementia. By 2030, so it's important to say that dementia is not a normal part of aging. Memory loss is, but dementia is not. By 2030, all baby boomers will be 65 and older, and the number of people living with dementia will continue to rise. This will lead to a greater need for caregivers who take care of elders living with dementia. By considering the person first and what areas of the brain and pathways remain, what can music do? What can personalized music do for the individual? This is my main research. The themes and maybe a guide for what familiar music can do and impact this population. As we saw in the video with Henry, music with personal meaning has the power to wake up a person. Music has the power to transport a person when it is personalized, such as my bubby who has dementia. When listening to Yiddish music, such as by Mir Bis Shane, she's transported back to memories of her parents, and she can express her self-identity, which is continuous, by sharing, for example, phrases in Yiddish that I didn't hear about until I showed her some music. Music that is familiar can also, it's a great tool to be used as an intervention for people undergoing changes in the mind, such as an inability to decipher language or speak language, and discomfort in their surroundings, which may lead to anxiety and other emotions, which also lead to behaviors such as agitation. The rhythmic component of music can synchronize states. It can cue smooth physical movements in people who struggle with walking, carrying them along as they walk to the beat. One example in my research was Hava Nagila. Music has the ability to affirm identity when someone does not feel to be in their prime. Sharing meaningful music tells the person that there is an essential you beneath your physical changes. Affirming identity and dignity at the end of life with familiar Jewish music becomes a way to connect not only to that person who is there, but also to the loved ones in the room. The only limitation that I've seen so far for using familiar music as a tool is that not everyone's brain connects meaning to music. Concluding thoughts, I'll end with this. Maybe the summation of what music can do for a variety of adults with physical and mental ailments and losses is this quote: "Music is a moral law. It gives soul to the universe, wings to the mind, flight to the imagination, a charm to sadness, gaiety and life to everything. It is the essence of order and leads to all that is good, just and beautiful, of which it is the invisible, but nevertheless dazzling, passionate, and eternal form." A timeless quote from Plato. Thank you so much for listening.
Rachel, thank you so much. That was so moving and important work in thinking about the pedagogy of music and its power, particularly for those with dementia, and how beyond perhaps the obvious we need to go in order to reach people who have not been able to be reached. Thank you for that. In turn to Becca. Becca's title is Transcending Age, an exploration of intergenerational spiritual development through Torah godly play in the liberal Jewish classroom. Over to you, Becca.
Great. I'm just gonna share this screen with you. Okay. Should be able to see it.
And there'll be a Google Doc as well for Becca coming in.
Great. So I will also start with really just from the bottom of my heart and my full heart, a thank you to Rabbi Dr. Michael Shire, who has been my mentor through this project and also really, I think, inspired a lot of the thinking I've been doing around this topic over the past 5 years. It's really a blessing to be able to work with the person who created this mode of, who I would say brought this mode godly play and Torah godly play into the Jewish world. And that has just been an unbelievable treat. And also to Deb, who has just really gracefully and with all of her passion and compassion shepherded all of us through this process. So thank you to the two of you and to the entire school and the cohort for all of the support in getting to this point. So I feel very excited to share with you a topic that I would say at large, what I want to talk about is the idea of intergenerational spiritual development. And in my smaller piece, want to talk about this through the practice of Torah godly play and godly play. So before we jump into the content of my thesis, I want to bring all of you into this, and I want to ask you to take a few seconds to think about a time or a moment that you had an interaction with somebody in a different generation, somebody who was a different age group than you, maybe a group of people, or when you were a part of an intergenerational group that felt meaningful to you. That was not just, oh, that was sweet, but it had a different feel to it. It was something that sparked something within you. And I'm going to invite folks, if you want, to use the chat function to either share the name of a person that comes to mind when you're thinking about this, or maybe a place, just a few words if you want to use that to just share some of what is being evoked for you when thinking about this interaction or experience that you've had in an intergenerational setting. Great. So you can continue to use that function. And why I wanted to start here is because I think the heart of what I am going to talk about and what I feel the most excited about, and what also makes this the most challenging, is that spirituality and these moments that I'm trying to talk about go beyond language. And so that is going to be the challenge that we're all holding here and that I'm holding with you today. And so my hope is that you can hold on to that feeling that you got when thinking about that moment, whether it was with a grandchild or a grandparent or in a nursing home on a visit, or with a stranger on the street or a child you were sitting across from on a train or a bus, but holding on to that feeling. So my initial wondering, what was I asking? What was I thinking about in this thesis? I wanted to ask the question, in what ways can Torah godly play promote spiritual development for both children and adults when conducted in an intergenerational setting? Some of this is going to say, what are all of these things? So we're going to get to it. Some definitions, so we're all on the same page. What is spirituality? As I said, it's incredibly hard to define what spirituality is. And in a lot of the research that I was doing, a lot of what people were saying was, it's really hard to define spirituality. It's pretty subjective. However, we're going to take an attempt at it, and I'll share some of the thoughts that were guiding me along this process. So the first is, it goes beyond words. That's exactly that feeling that I was talking about, that moment that sparked those times when you feel it, you're in it, and the words aren't going to capture what it is exactly that you're feeling. It involves the senses, right? Like body language, your emotions, faces, seeing people. It goes beyond that. And then it involves relationship and relational consciousness. And this language, a lot of these 3 bullet points come from Rebecca Nye, who studies spirituality and specifically children's spirituality, but it goes way beyond that. And so what Nye says is not that spirituality is not something that likes to be confined to words, right? It's something that we feel through senses, our nonverbal intuition, such as sight and touch and smell. She goes on to say that spirituality can be a powerful kind of knowing that is less worried about proving how you know. This is about something that we know. We have this innate understanding of how things work, And sometimes we just know, and we can't prove that. It's just what we're experiencing. And this isn't just something for children, although she's using her research in children. I looked at Brene Brown, who is a researcher and social worker and doctor who does a lot of work around shame and also anything and everything you could imagine. And her definition of spirituality, she says, spirituality is recognizing and celebrating that we are all inextricably connected to each other by a power greater than all of us, and that our connection to that power and to one another is grounded in love and compassion, right? So connection is the key to spirituality, which is going to lead me to the intergenerational aspect of this and why I think there are benefits to doing spirituality with intergenerational work. But my computer wants to go faster than I do. Still, okay. Intergenerational spiritual, not sure why this is happening. Intergenerational spiritual development. In thinking about intergenerational, what does it mean? Different age groups together, but it's not just different age groups, right? We think about our synagogues, we think about our communities, and we say, oh, my synagogue's really intergenerational. However, we're siloed, right? You walk into shul and you say, great, I'm gonna go to shul, I'm gonna go to the service, the kids are gonna either run around in the hallway or they're gonna go to their Tat Shabbat, or they're gonna have some experience, and we're all just gonna have our own experiences. There's adult learning and then there's Hebrew school, right? We're intergenerational in the sense that we are sharing the space, we are there together, but are we really having these moments of spiritual connection that we're bridging and really consciously thinking about how we're connecting to one another? Other ideas and parts that will make this successful are mutuality and equality when it comes to age, and also learning and growing together, doing things collaboratively, that it's not just we all exist, but how are we all coexisting and adding to each other's spiritual growth. So how should this be done? And that is where Torah Godly Play comes in, and Godly Play, the practice. Godly Play and Torah Godly Play is an amazing model of learning and growing, and it's not only for learning's sake though. This is where we go beyond. It's about spiritual development, and it was created by Jerome Berryman in the US and has been developed over the years, and Rabbi Michael Shire brought it into the Jewish community, calling it Torah Godly Play. And this is, as you can see, the figures that are on the board here, these little wooden figures. It's a way of storytelling that draws us into the story, that allows us to own the story. And it's not about acquiring knowledge. It's just about having a spiritual experience. And it starts with an introduction, and it's a way of storytelling that also weaves in a feel of liturgy and a feel of prayer, that it's a very unique model. Following the storytelling, there will be wondering. There's an option, there's a portion of just saying, I wonder what you liked best about the story. It's expanding our consciousness. It's opening us up to this idea of, this is an experience that I own as much as it is a knowledge that I'm trying to acquire. And finally, you have exploration time, where people can use different art projects and different ways, again, to connect to the story. And finally, a snack and a conclusion. And this model, what's so special about this is that Jerome Berryman made this for children. It's specifically for children, and it's a community of children. And it's a beautiful, beautiful model, and it's based on trust, play, wonder, and he also talks about this theology of childhood. So trust, in any sense, to have spiritual growth, especially for children, but for all of us, we need to have an environment where we feel safe and we trust one another. Play. While play sounds like it's only for children, it's important as adults that we open and expand our minds, especially in the spiritual realm, to start playing a little bit. And wonder is a part of life, and we lose it as we get older. However, we need to keep that alive and that spark. And wonder is not just something that we see Jerome Berryman and the Christian world talking about, but Heschel speaks boundlessly about wonder and thinking and different kinds of wonder and awe. And then we have the theology of childhood, which on one foot, and I'm excited to share more at some other point, is the idea that we can connect to childhood, and it's not just about being a child. It's actually a state that we can enter and come in and out of, and that it connects us to God. It connects us to each other. It connects us to the world. And it's a way of us being able to say, I am open and excited to wondering and being in that space of unknown. So my exploration was a little bit sidetracked with COVID, but I did surveys and interviews and was able to collect data from both the Christian world and the Jewish world. And what I came up with, what I found, there are practitioners who make some changes when doing intergenerational groups, meaning they want to invite the adults in a certain way. There are challenges that come up with intergenerational groups, which if you're creating a space for children of trust, sometimes adults can take up a lot of space and can say there's a right and a wrong. And part of wondering is saying there's no right and there's no wrong, which breaks down a lot of the way adults see and interact with the world. And there are incredible benefits to doing intergenerational Torah godly play of expanding our minds. For adults, it's being with children and being sparked back to that wonder and that awe in such a pure way. And for children, being able to recognize that they are a part of something much larger in a spiritual practice. And the last thing I'll say is in the Jewish world, we see a lot of language. What I'm taking away from this is we see a lot of language around family education. Family education is bringing kids and their parents together. We see less around intergenerational spiritual development and thinking about what is this as a spiritual practice, not just midor lador, from generation to generation. I want to impart this knowledge on you, but I want to have this shared experience where it's mutually beneficial to both of us in terms of our spiritual growth and development. What I learned, what I'm taking away from it, intergenerational groups are really holy. The practitioners all said it. There is something spectacular. Go back to that moment that you're thinking about at the beginning. There is something there beyond words. There is something that happens when we as a group are coming together between ages. Another piece that I found from the research was it's actually important to keep those groups of children together, to give them that ownership, to make them the ones who are the professionals when it comes to godly play, but also run intergenerational groups and allow for spaces, both of the intergenerational coming together and the children. That in the Jewish community, we actually might not be able to jump to the Torah godly play and spiritual development until we have shared language around spirituality and what it is to have spiritual practice, which we use a lot of education, but there's a lot of room for growth there. And finally, two things that I'm thinking a lot about and further wonderings, which I thought I would be seeing more of in my research, was more interaction between age groups in the sessions. I didn't see people speaking about this happened and there was conversation between somebody of X age and Y age, and it really sparked this amazing experience for both of them or for the rest of the group. And finally, body language. None of the practitioners spoke about that body language, what was happening as the participants were experiencing this as a group. And so in conclusion, there are many, many ways this can be researched more. And I feel very excited to think about how this can expand Jewish education, but not only Jewish education, Jewish hearts, minds, and souls as we move forward.
Becca, thank you so much. Wonderful. It's been exciting to see you do this work and to think about it. Intergenerational spiritual development, something I think is new for us all to think about what that means. Even when we think about the intergenerational spaces we are in every day, we wonder what impact they're having on us, whether it's Friday night dinner or it's indeed people were mentioning in the chat, their synagogue communities or other communities that they're in. Thank you for making us think about that. I'm sure people will want to ask you more about that later on. we're going to go now. We've done music, we've done story, and now we're going to do prayer, spontaneous prayer, and particularly the tradition of Tachina, which Noam's going to explain to us. Noam, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rabbi Dr. Michael Shire and Deborah, and just for all of your support. And also, I just feel, it feels really right that I'm in this group with Rachel and Becca, because I actually feel like we're all very connected, and my project feels similar to both of yours. Just gonna share my screen. Okay. All right. Can everyone see me? Okay. So I focused on the topic of Yiddish techinas and spontaneous prayer. And I called it an unbroken chain because my grandmother was actually my inspiration for this project. My grandmother used to pray in Yiddish spontaneously throughout the day. And once I started learning Yiddish, I became more interested in it. And I noticed that her prayers were really similar to Yiddish techinas, to the patterns, particularly the openings and the closings of the prayers. And so I asked her, have you ever prayed from these prayer books that were specifically for women? And she said no. And so I was just curious, perhaps her mother prayed from them, or her mother's mother. And I was just wondering, I wanted to learn about the practice of Yiddish techinas and how they were prayed, and also how they can connect to people today. And so how best to do this than to create new melodies paired with the traditional Yiddish words that were in these prayer books. So I started reading through these books, as you see on the page, and I found sections that I thought could be reintroduced into our prayer spaces today. And I placed new melodies to them. Then I created a workshop and where I taught them, and I really explored what are Yiddish techinas from these books, and also what is spontaneous prayer. And so my guiding question for my thesis was, in what ways do the history, liturgical voice, and melodies of Yiddish techinas enhance people's connection to spontaneous prayer? And can both Yiddish techinas and spontaneous prayer be claimed as a potentially feminist and boundary-pushing part of the Jewish prayer tradition? So as we're together, I just, and you can also place this in the chat if you like, but a question for all of us to hold is, how has traditional prayer been passed down in your own family? That's one thing that we explored in our class together. So we really explored what stories of prayer exist that you didn't even know were there. And also we challenged the idea of what is Jewish prayer. You know, when I was in Jewish day school, I learned Jewish prayer is in a siddur and is set liturgy in Hebrew, but what else can Jewish prayer look like and mean? And another question that was raised for me personally in this project is how does transmission work, and how does memory work? How do we transmit traditions without even realizing that we're doing it? And because so little was recorded by historians about techinas and about how they were practiced, it really requires a lot of imagination. So that's kind of what we explored in the class that I taught. So you may be wondering, what are Yiddish techinas? Yiddish techinas are Ashkenazi devotional prayers written in Yiddish in the prayer books that you saw on the first page. They are connected to life cycle events specific to women. So that includes, there were tchinas written for women who experienced miscarriages and who were trying to get pregnant, or around Nida, around lighting Shabbat candles. So it's specific to women's mitzvot. And then they were also connected to Jewish time. So in all the Yiddish Tchinas books that I have, there's a special prayer for every Rosh Chodesh, for every single month of the year. And there's, I mean, it's pretty profound, all the various things. There's prayers for Yizkor that are separate from what one can find in a traditional Siddur. Yiddish Tchinas also refer to spontaneous prayer. So kind of like what my grandmother was doing, just praying in the vernacular. And so a question that I held was, did women in Rebbe Nachman's life actually influence his teaching on Hitbodedut? Because it's very similar to the way women prayed, because they did not have access to so much of the Hebrew and Aramaic learning, and they were not bound to praying in a minyan. That's why they would pray spontaneously, and they had a more creative outlet for their prayers. So who prayed from Tchinas books? Women who could read Yiddish, but did not have access to traditional Jewish learning. Women who were fluent in Hebrew and Aramaic. So there were some women that did have access to learning, and they actually chose to, a lot of times they chose to pray from Tchinas books instead of a traditional Siddur. And so in the women's section of the synagogue, there was, the prayer leader was called a Verzogerin or a Zogerke, and she would oftentimes lead women in prayers using the Tchinas. And in my research, I found that sometimes Verzogerins would create a special Techina for a specific woman if she asked her to do it. And then another thing that I found in my research, which was interesting, was in the inner cover of Techina's book, sometimes it would say, this book is for women and for men who are like women. This referred to men who were poor and working class and maybe did not have access to yeshivas or to higher learning. And so they actually they were illiterate in Hebrew and Aramaic. And so then these books were also for them. Who wrote Tchinas? So rabbis wrote Tchinas, and sometimes it is known. Daughters of rabbis wrote Tchinas, so women who had access to more learning, including Sora Rivka Rachalea Bas Yukel Horowitz. She was fascinating. She was very learned in Talmud and would actually tutor young boys. And Sora Bas Tovim, Shifra Bas Yosef, and there were other women authors that are known. But most Tchinas were written by anonymous authors. And it would say this Tchina was written by a Isha Tznuah, a modest woman, and a Groisa Tzedekis, a great righteous woman. But what's interesting is a lot of times men who left the Orthodox world and became, they were interested more in Yiddish literature. This is more in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They would write Tchinas, and they would say that they were an anonymous woman writing these Tchinas. And so I thought there was something really interesting about that as far as gender. And I talk about that in my thesis. So the methods that I used is in the class, I use storytelling. So I started the class explaining my grandmother's practice, and then I asked people to, before that, I asked folks to share what they knew about spontaneous prayer from their own life experiences, and we talked about that. And then I shared a story of my grandmother, and I played a video of her praying. And then I told a story about my mother's prayer practice and how it is very similar to my grandmother's and also is very different. And so I asked people if they had similar stories in their own family of just how prayer was practiced. And it brought up a lot of really interesting stories. Some people didn't even realize that, that their mother had, this practice of every time before they left on a trip, they would all sit down and bless each other for a safe journey. And so it was just really interesting to see what came up in these stories. We had a coverage study of the original Yiddish tchinas with a translation that I brought so they could really dive into the text. We sang the original Yiddish tchinas with new melodies that I created. And then we sang contemporary tchinas. So this, I'll talk about a little later, but basically what are tchinas today? What can spontaneous prayer look like today? And then we did a writing exercise to create liturgy that participants wished existed within the Jewish canon. And so I timed us and we had 5 minutes to just free write a prayer. And then we shared bits of those prayers. And then I collected feedback from a survey following the class. And then from what I learned there, I interviewed participants to learn more about their prayer life and to really dive in and to see what did they discover about their own families and their own relationship to spontaneous prayer. And were they interested in this topic and interested in engaging in tchinas literature? So can engaging with tchinas inspire connection to history and spontaneous prayer? Yes. So as I shared earlier, all these beautiful stories came out of people not realizing that, wow, their grandmother used to say this special prayer before she would light the Shabbat candles, and in English, but still it was outside of the Jewish prayer canon. And I also noticed in my interviews that there were two people whose families were secular. They had kind of lost Jewish practice, but still both of their grandmothers retained their connection to superstitions. So it's almost like a remnant of prayer, and it's similar to prayer in a lot of ways. And I noticed that even in families where there was maybe a break from Jewish tradition a few generations ago, and then the mother kind of reclaimed Jewish practice. In one family, the participant's mother used to tuck her in, and they would pray every night, the spontaneous prayer that they had written together. And so I also found that people were able to connect to these old tchinas by singing them, and they were able to kind of embody them through song. Oops.
No, we're going to be reaching the end of our time. So I know that you wanted to share with us one of these, so maybe you'll move to that now.
Yeah. So I can do that right. So this is a prayer that I discovered last spring, and I thought the words were really powerful. It's God, you don't shame a broken heart, which I have not seen that before. You witness pain from the one who laments, and when the wailer calls out, you listen closely. And so in class, I had people kind of put their hands on their hearts and really feel the power of these words. And I taught the melody to it. And I think just because so much is happening in our world right now, I'm dedicating this song to all the people who are crying out in the streets right now, and to the justice that they are seeking. So feel free to follow along. And if you'd like, I can send a recording later. Als brach in Herz, tust du nicht verschämen. 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 Du siehst die Pein von die, was jammern. Du siehst die Pein von die, was jammern. Und wenn der Klage ruft, tust du ihm der Herren. Thank you all, and really appreciate it.
Danke, we're grateful to you, Noam, for that beautiful rendition and for sharing us and for introducing us to this age-old but contemporary new way of being creative in the sense of prayer, spontaneous prayer, and prayers that talk to the heart of who we are. And been lots of discussion in the chat there, and lots of suggestions and thoughts, and it certainly touched a lot of people. So we've come to kind of the formal ending of the session, but I'm going to leave things open because we do have time now because it's a lunch break. So let's just have some time together to talk. I'm going to especially invite you to think about the ways in which these three these three presentations allowed us to think about creative options for new pedagogies in Jewish education. Is anybody who would like to throw something out for the three of them to think about? Well, I'm going to I'm going to ask something, particularly about this notion that Becky, you talked about knowing beyond language. And I think in all three, we have this idea that both in music, in prayer, and in story, and particularly in intergenerational story, there's this knowing that goes beyond language. The problem, of course, for us in education is how to know. If you don't have the language, then how do you know, how do you assess, how do you know that there's something happening, that something's changing, that there's transformation, that there's transmission, as you also said. So I'm just interested in your sense of how we can evaluate these pedagogies. How do we know that they're really working, and what impact are they having on people? Do you have any thoughts about that from the research you did? Rachel, Becca, or Noam?
Maybe stop sharing the screen so we can see everybody, Noam.
Great. Becca, yes.
Sorry, do you mind just repeating the last part of the question?
How do we know we've had an impact? If it's beyond language, how do you know it's actually had an impact on people?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think evaluation for this is one of the hardest pieces, especially I ended up using surveys in my piece. And so it was really just hearing from the practitioners and when they're leading a group, how they would evaluate if there is impact. I think it's exactly what happened. As I was watching, Rachel, the video that you showed, like that moment, and I started choking up, and then the people I could see on the screen started to choke up. And I think that's how you know if there's impact. Like, it is, again, an unspoken impact, but I don't think that that's necessarily such a bad thing. And I think that's what goes into the tchinas, the prayers of like, it's actually okay as educators to try and have a goal, which is to impact the emotional experience and spiritual experience of those who we are educating, teaching, being in community with.
Rachel, maybe you comment on this because you're working with dementia patients, but also people I think were interested in the chat about people of all ages and the power of music on their lives.
Yes, I think that because music is invisible and the ability to see the impacts of spirituality is usually invisible, I think that especially with music, one way you can see it having an impact on, and one of the questions I got was not just what does it look like in not just the elderly community, but in all communities, where you can see people tapping, you can see people dancing and breathing differently, and their eyes light up, their eyes open. Things that you can't see when you could hear. Maybe people aren't going to all of a sudden be able to carry the most thoughtful conversation, but they'll be singing or they'll be humming. There's a lot of things that you can see and hear, or maybe even other senses that all of a sudden come alive.
Right, and you gave us those descriptors of I wrote a few down: waking people up, calming them, affirming their identity. Those kind of descriptors that help us know that things are happening. Yeah. Noam, you actually worked with this class, and what impact did teaching them have, do you think?
Teaching the music?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I asked that question in the interviews, and for a lot of people, I mean, it was a way for them to really connect to the words more deeply and to embody them by singing them. But for some of them, they found that it was hard to catch on to the melodies, and they wished that they could have listened to them ahead of time. Also, it was a different language. So they felt like they were walking away not actually knowing the melody. They would have liked more time with it. So I'm just thinking, how can I do that? You know, because it is a language that a lot of people aren't familiar with. But I would be curious to teach them to elders, and particularly people that are more familiar with Yiddish. The thing though is my grandfather had Alzheimer's, and I used to sing with him in Yiddish, and I think what was important was actually he knew the melodies more than the words. Mm-hmm. So I would just be curious. I've never particularly taught new melodies to elders, but it was definitely impactful.
Right. I wonder if Louise would like to comment on, I know you're advising Rachel in her work.
Yes, Rachel and I had a lot of wonderful discussions about the impact that music had with the elderly, and many stories that you could see it, as Rachel said, you could see it when people teared up, when singing by, at a hospice bed, by the bed of a relative. You could see the families tearing up, and just knowing that the music made a difference. And I think it's going back to that spirituality that Becca was talking about. You can feel it in the air. You just have a sense of the difference that it makes.
Great, thank you. Any questions? I know there's a lot in the Google Doc for everyone to look at, but is there any final question, comment people wanted to ask?
I would, I just wanted to jump in. I thought that this also captures some of this conversation. I didn't think about this group. I thought about this as creativity, but I feel like the shift in the group is actually around this idea of how are we educating beyond goals that we can measure through language, essentially, with music and with tchinas and with prayer and with that intergenerational interaction. And one of the quotes that I came across in my learning when I was thinking about wondering from Heschel is this distinction between the prophet and the philosopher. And he talks about these two different kinds of knowledge. And what he says basically is that he says when we're trying to acquire, like the acquisition of knowledge, which he refers to as the wondering of the philosopher, versus, which is like a rational wondering. And then he goes on to talk about the wondering of the prophet. And he says, so the prophet's wonder is a form of thinking. It's not the beginning of knowledge, but an act that goes beyond knowledge. It does not come to an end when knowledge is acquired. It is an attitude that never ceases. There is no answer in the world to man's radical amazement. And I think it's exactly that. As educators, that's the challenge of saying, how are we stepping into that role of saying, we're teaching you to start that journey to have this mindset. It's not about I'm trying to give you, obviously we need to give over information, but are we doing a good job of feeling comfortable in that space where we're saying, no, actually we want to teach you to be we want to teach you to be prophets in that sense of curious learners.
Well, that's a beautiful statement. I see Susan would like to comment as well. You're muted, Susan.
Thank you. I just want to make a comment on this because I thought that there was one moment in this morning's proceedings that gives another part of the answer, not to negate the really important things everybody just said, but there's also the post-experience connection and putting language to that. So I thought about, I was asked to think about a mentor and an experience. So in pulling back to consciousness, I then realized, wow, in that moment, there was all of this other stuff going on. And then I started to be able to put some words around it that I wouldn't have then. Then it was a really powerful experience. But we also then have the reflection on experience that, traditional evaluation sometimes gets there, but very rarely, because it's time consuming. And evaluation isn't very well funded usually and all of that. But I bet if you ask some of the questions to us about listening today and how some of us might have had this deeper kind of experience, just even over Zoom, you would be able to document that something powerful happened. So I hope that that frees up the sense of how you could get at information and get at sort of mining people's experiences for that.
Beautiful, thank you, Susan. We definitely seem to be in a watershed moment in Jewish education between these two worlds of domain subject material and what we might call social, emotional, spiritual learning, and how to understand both what each of them are and the balance between them, the integration of them, and as Susan said, kind of how do we get back to language once we've been into the experience of whether it's mystical or spiritual, or indeed, as Noam suggests, superstitious, which is a word that we've used to deride a sense of knowing. And do we, and as Noam suggests to us, there is a feminist way of knowing for which a different kind of wisdom, a different kind of knowing may emerge, particularly through ritual moments and experiences like Tehina. So thank you so much, everyone. It's been a very rich session, really fantastic to have learned with you in all of these ways. As Deb Einhorn always tells us, that you are now the masters, the mistresses, the owners of your own knowledge and learning, and we hope that you will take this forward to share with others in the years of your own career in the world ahead. So we're going to take a break. You can turn off your camera. You can go and get something to eat. We would have provided you lunch. At 12:15, we're going to come back for a little prize ceremony, and at 12:30, we'll have our fourth panel. So we look forward to seeing you all then, and we'll take some time for silence, since we were told this morning that's important too. This is a real break.